In this lecture, I want to talk about something that interests all of us, namely sex in marriage. God invented sex. It goes to a basic part of who we are. And if the Bible's advice is followed, that will lead to strong, dynamic, and happy marriages among Christians. Now, some people tend to think that the body's soul and spirit are holy, but the body itself is dirty. That's totally wrong. God made human beings as body-soul unities. God created the body, and at the end of creation, he looked at what he created and said, everything is very good. So the physical body, we have a physical part, our body, and a non-physical, immaterial part, our soul and spirit. And since the body was created by God, its appetites, including sexual appetites, are normal, and they're to be satisfied as long as it's done in the way that God has ordained. And we also need to know that our body is not divorced from our mind, our emotions, and so on and so forth. In fact, what we think, how we feel, our immaterial part influences our physical part, and vice versa. So we are holistic in that way. Now, God created people to have sex only in permanent monogamous marriages. The Bible sets forth a consistent sexual ethic. And the Bible always sets forth God's ideal. Sexual relations are to take place within the context of a permanent, in other words, a lifelong monogamous marriage. And you see that indicated in Genesis 2, Matthew 19, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 Timothy 3, and other places. Now, the reason why he called for sex to take place within the context of marriage is related to the way he designed us in the first place. There's two sexes, male and female. They are complementary. And so, in some ways, the sexes are designed to complement each other. Now, it is true, celibacy is a calling for some, but marriage is God's calling for most people. And assuming that we are called to be married, there's, as we've discussed in previous lectures, there is something missing in me, the man, that only my wife can fill. There's something missing in her as a woman that only I can fill. And so by ourselves, both the man and the woman are incomplete, but to be whole, we need to be united. And this incompleteness actually is an incredible blessing because it makes it possible for me to give myself wholly to my wife, and it gives me a motive to do so. And you see, the gift of my whole self to my wife is the gift that I can give no one else, and I'm giving my whole self. In other words, I can't partly give myself because myself is indivisible. And the only way to give myself is to give myself entirely. Because the gift of self is total, it has to exclude all others. And if it doesn't do this, then truly giving of my whole self has not taken place, which is one reason why polygamy is contrary to God's plan, because, they're a man, he has a number of wives. You're never going to be able to give yourself wholly to anyone that way. You're parceling yourself out and so on. The woman is the one, who gets cheated, but actually the man gets cheated too in a polygamous relationship because, the woman has to share herself and her husband with many other women, but the man can never have the level of intimacy that God created for men and women to have in the state of marriage, which is why God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eve and Mary and Sarah. There are implications for this creation order. Now, also, and I think we touched on this in earlier lectures, in addition to fulfilling God's design for human nature, a lifelong monogamous relationship is designed to reflect spiritual realities. And so, again, we become one flesh. That is mirroring in a physical way the oneness, the plurality, but also the oneness of the Trinity itself. It is mirroring Christ's relationship with his church. Christ had only one bride, and he is faithful to her. He builds her up. He gave himself for her. So we are to have one spouse and forsake all others. Just as Jesus said, I will never leave you or forsake you. On the other hand, the spiritual nature of marriage and sex are also reflected in the fact that sexual immorality throughout the Bible is a metaphor and is a symbol of spiritual idolatry. The Bible equates sexual immorality with forsaking God and pursuing other gods and ungodly practices. And we see that in Jeremiah 3, Ezekiel 16, Hosea 2, Hosea 4, 1 Corinthians 6, James 4, and a number of places in the book of Revelation. So again, marriage is spiritual, and that is seen both when marriage is being done well and the man and woman are one. That's reflecting deep spiritual realities, but also sex is spiritual, and we see that when sexual immorality takes place. So marriage and sex, they are linked, and ultimately they reflect spiritual realities. Now, in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 12 through 20, Paul says this, talking about sex. He says, do you not, actually verses 15 through 20 I'll read, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May it never be. Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says the two shall become one flesh. Again, he's quoting Genesis 2, verse 24. But the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. Flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. In this passage, Paul is showing us that we are integrated beings. We can't do something with our bodies that does not affect our spirits. And that is true for everybody in the world, especially for Christians, because Christ has bought and paid for us. And we have been joined with Christ both physically and spiritually. Remember, we're joined with him physically. Well, obviously, we're joined with him spiritually, but we're clearly joined with him physically in two ways. We are called his body. The church is his body. And individuals are called his body as well. But also, he has come to live inside us in the person of the Holy Spirit. He is living inside of our bodies. And consequently, what Paul is saying is, when we engage in sexual immorality, in other words, you have sex with a prostitute, you have sex outside of marriage, you commit fornication, in other words, sex between unmarried people, or you commit adultery, sex with somebody other than your spouse, what Paul is saying is that when we do that, it is as if we are making Christ himself engage in immoral acts. That's why sex, it's spiritual, but it's far deeper than we can possibly, than most of the time we think about. And so, the Bible's sexual ethic basically is this: fidelity in marriage and abstinence outside of marriage. And so for all of these reasons, God's design of human nature, the spiritual nature of marriage and sex, as a result of that, God constantly calls for sexual fidelity in marriage. See Hebrews 13, verse 4, and requires sexual abstinence outside of marriage. See Matthew 19, verses 11 and 12, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 7 through 9, and other places. The Bible repeatedly condemns all forms of sexual immorality, and that includes sex by unmarried people, also known as fornication. Deuteronomy 22, verses 13 through 21, and other passages. The book lists all of the passages here. It condemns sex by married people with people other than their spouse. It condemns prostitution, homosexuality, incest, rape, and bestiality. So again, the Bible has a consistent sexual ethic. Now, if we adhere to the Bible's sexual ethic of fidelity in marriage and abstinence outside of marriage, there are a number of spiritual and physical results. First, sexual fidelity keeps an open channel of fellowship with God, which is not blocked or quenched by sin. Look at Isaiah 59, verse 2, Malachi 2, verse 13 through 16, and 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 19. Secondly, sexual fidelity prevents the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV/AIDS. And we talked about the fact that women particularly are more susceptible to sexually transmitted diseases, and typically those sexually transmitted diseases are more serious in women. Now, let's take a look at the basic purposes of sex according to the Bible. Well, first, of course, is reproduction. In Genesis 1, verses 27 and 28, God told Adam and Eve, I want you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so God has given us the sex drive as one of the most potent human drives so that men and women would reproduce the human race. You might say that procreation is the basic or underlying purpose of sex. Every other biological function, seeing, eating, walking, speaking, hearing, eliminating waste, only one body is required to do the job. But procreation is the only vital function of life that no one can perform by himself or by herself. And the sexual differences between males and females are designed with procreation in mind. And the sexual powers both actually bring about and are necessary for procreation. I mean, that's just the way men and women are designed. Now, God's plan to populate heaven includes populating the earth. And that's one reason why people are made in the image of God. In an earlier lecture, we pointed out that God's mandate for people was to fill the earth, in part so that his image and glory would be spread over the entire earth instead of just being limited to the Garden of Eden. Now, the fact of the matter is, people have now filled the earth. There are people in every tribe, tongue, country, continent in the entire world, and we will talk about that more when we get to the lecture regarding family planning. But the fact of the matter is that people have filled the earth. Of course, the image of God has been tarnished, as we talked about in the lecture on men and women and the image of God. But insofar as procreation is concerned, when that happens, with sex comes children. And with children come relationships, roles, and responsibilities of parenthood and family life. Now, one sociologist studying this points out that children, young ones especially, thrive less in orphanages than in the average family. Even when care is taken to make the institutions, orphanages, home-like, and even when they are better organized than the average family in every respect, hygienically, medically, psychologically, and otherwise, children thrive with having a mom and dad at home. They thrive better than in orphanages, in state institutions, and in one-parent families. There is something about the institution of marriage, husband and wife, both living together, that makes a huge difference for the children. We talked about that a little bit in an earlier lecture, that marriage itself is a positive benefit, especially for men, also for women, but especially for men. It tends to civilize them when we do it right, and it is also particularly important for children. And as with marriage, the family, which is the result of procreation, has spiritual significance. Family is a frequently used metaphor for our relationship to Him. We are the family of God. And we see that in a number of different places. But sex was designed more than just for procreation. Sex was designed to enjoy and to enhance marital love. Again, God created sex. And Genesis 2 suggests that Adam and Eve were enjoying sex long before there were any children or before there was sin. You know, one level of meaning of the fact that husband and wife are one flesh, of course, is sexual union. And therefore, sex is not sinful. God intended pleasure for His creatures. And, you know, even in 1 Timothy 6, it says that God created everything for us to enjoy. And, you know, of course, I think largely in context, it's talking about material things, but one of those things He created for us to enjoy is sex. And, you know, it includes, and one we know that because God created, you know, the special areas. I mean, for the male, the genital areas for both male and female, male, the penis is, I mean, it's just packed through with sensitivity and pleasure, and that's why God created, you know, in the woman, the clitoris, which has nothing to do with reproduction, okay? It's there simply for sexual pleasure. So clearly the way men and women have been designed is that in part, sex is beyond just reproduction, but is designed for pleasure. Because, I mean, for example, my wife and I, she's gone through menopause some years ago, so we can't have children anymore, but we can still have sex. And, you know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will. I mean, it's nice that our kids, we had 6 kids, they're out of the house now. And, you know, when you're raising kids, it's harder to have time alone with your spouse. And the kids are there, you're tired, you're raising them and stuff. Now our kids are out of the house. So we have the time and opportunity uninterruptedly, whereby we can have sex just for the fun of it. And I can tell you, having been married for more than 40 years, we now know each other. We know each other's bodies. We know what the other person likes and what they don't like. And so our sex life is better now than it was 30 years ago. And that's the way I think God plans it. I mean, if you take care of your body and you know your spouse well, you know what they like, what they don't like, and all of that, I mean, your marriage in all ways, including sexual, can be better toward the end than it was in the beginning. Now, so, and doing that, I mean, having sex, there's an enhancement and a deeper enjoyment in the relationship that contributes to the intimacy. I mean, sex and an intimate relationship go hand in hand. The deeper you fall in love with your spouse and show it through the 5 love languages, the deeper you're committed to your spouse, your sex life is going to be better. And the better your sex life, the greater the relationship. And so, you know, sex, sometimes it's analogized to food. I mean, our taste buds register some flavors as delicious and others bitter, so we eat the things that are good for us and avoid the things that might be poisonous. Well, in sex, it doesn't just have to be done in the dark and so on and so forth. I mean, yes, it feels good. We want to reproduce, but there are interesting ways that human beings sexually are different from animals. In animals, the female, typically, they only have sex when the female is fertile. For us, sex feels good anytime, when a woman is fertile and can have children. You can have sex anytime during the month, not just when she's ovulating. And again, you can have sex after she goes through menopause. But also, there's another difference, and that is researchers suspect that only among humans is the female capable of having an orgasm. So far as researchers know, among the animals, the birds, the animals, the fish, the female is not able to have an orgasm. And now again, orgasms have nothing to do with reproduction. And so again, we have a motive for sex among humans because it is a kind of deep pleasure that you can't get anywhere else. And there's another thing that distinguishes humans from animals. Humans are probably the only beings that have sex facing each other. I mean, if you look at the other animals, it's typically the male is behind the female. They're not looking at each other. But again, humans, sex is more than just physical. And it's a bonding thing when you can have sex and you're facing each other. I mean, you can be looking deeply into the person's eyes, stroking their face, and so on and so forth. And so again, the way God has designed us, there's a similarity, of course, between sex between humans and sex among animals, but there are, I think, significant differences whereby sex is designed for more than procreation, but it's designed to help bond us together in joy and in love. And so, the meaning of sex, it's really kind of the most bonding thing that one can do to help forge a relationship that will last for life. Now, you look at the Bible, too. The Bible treats the subject of sex with great realism, both good and bad. I mean, Jacob having sex with his daughter-in-law Tamar, that's bad. But look at the book of Song of Solomon is in the Bible, which basically is a story celebrating human love and especially the sexual aspects of marriage. And so what the Bible is doing by including the Song of Solomon is affirming that sex in itself is good and pure. The sex drive is a normal, good thing in men and women. It's God-given, and there's nothing to be ashamed about regarding it. And so, sex is a gift of God to be celebrated and enjoyed. And therefore, the quality of our sexual relations is important. Each partner should prepare, learn from the other one, teach the other one, and do his best to arouse the other one and help the other one have as satisfying an experience as possible. The Song of Solomon would not be in the Bible if that were not true. And so, I know particularly when people are young, they're embarrassed and so on. But I'll tell you something, the more you know your spouse, you can say, listen, could you do it like this? Or, I don't like it the way you do that. Talk about this so that they know clearly, okay, this is what he likes. This is what she likes. This is how I should do it to most please her, and take the time and do it. Sexual relations, it's called sexual relations because it's very relational. it's a means of thanksgiving. We can express our thankfulness for the other person. It's a means of reconciling if you've had a quarrel. It's a powerful way of reinforcing the husband's masculinity and the wife's femininity. And it's a means of sustaining and helping us. And I should point out, I mentioned the clitoris earlier. Unfortunately, some cultures, Muslim culture, and I hope not, but I know in some African cultures, even among Christians, there is something called female circumcision, also known as female genital mutilation. A terrible thing. But, if a woman has had her clitoris removed, the husband, it's designed so she won't be able to have an orgasm. God did not, God designed women to be able to have orgasms. But if you are married to a woman who has had her clitoris removed, you've got to demonstrate the love of Christ and the love of your wife, especially in bed, by words of love and affirmation, by spending quality time with her, by cuddling, massage, and loving touch. Do whatever you can in the face of the fact that, she has had her clitoris removed. Now, I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about marriage, and he points out in verses 1 and 2, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for man not to touch a woman, but because of immoralities, let each man love or have his own wife, and each woman have her own husband." In other words, he's saying, if you're single, you shouldn't be having sex, but it's because of immoralities. We're all tempted, and so one of the reasons for marriage is to prevent sexual immorality. But he goes on to say in verse 3, "Lest the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband." Marriage partners have a sexual duty to each other. It's not only pleasure, but it's a duty. I owe my wife, a duty to meet her sexual needs, and she has a duty to me in that regard. I need to sacrifice myself for her, just as Christ loved her, and so on. And typically, it takes women a longer time to become sexually aroused and a longer time to achieve orgasm. And so, men don't just have an orgasm and then turn over and go to sleep and leave your wife frustrated. So you need to be aware of that because, God designed her with the ability and so on. And so we need to do this. And so we need to understand, as I say, men tend to have a greater desire for more frequent sexual release because of greater testosterone levels and larger sex centers in the brain. Wives need to understand that about husbands. Men need to understand that it typically takes women longer to achieve orgasm, and they may not achieve it every time. It's much easier for men. We need to understand those differences, take them into account. But we need to understand also, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4, marriage partners have mutual sexual rights. The wife does not have authority over her body, but the husband does. And likewise also, the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. So in other words, once you become married, my body no longer belongs exclusively to me, but it belongs to my wife and vice versa. And so, we're to be one flesh. It doesn't say, verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 7 does not say that the marriage partners are to demand their rights at all costs, but rather to give up their rights to meet the sexual needs of their partner. Sometime we may not be able to meet those needs if your mate is sick, or there's some physical dysfunction, or you're overly tired, or you're fasting or praying. But many marriages can trace a marital breakup to problems in the bedroom. So Paul, in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5, sort of concludes this by saying, "Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control." What he's talking about is sexual relations. He's saying, for temporary reasons, for prayer or other things, you may mutually agree to abstain from sex for a period of time, but it shouldn't be a long period of time, because Satan is the one behind you, tempting you, and trying to break up your marriage sexually. And note that he's saying Satan uses sexual deprivation of one spouse by the other as one of his strategies to tempt the marriage partners to anger, discord, and infidelity. Therefore, Paul recognizes that not only does sexual fidelity have spiritual implications, but sexual responsiveness does as well. It is a wonderful thing. It is deeper than most of us think. And it's learned. So don't be embarrassed to talk with your spouse about it. Find out what he or she likes, do your best, and practice. It'll get better, and believe me, it is worth it.